Good evening, everybody. May I give you a really warm welcome on behalf of the University Library of Cambridge here at the wonderful Robinson College who are hosting us, and a welcome to the first of this year's Sandars Lectures in Bibliography. If I haven't met you before, hello to everyone who is here in person and also online. My name's Jessica Gardner and I'm the University Librarian for Cambridge. So it's absolutely a thrill to me to host this year's lectures, of which more in just a moment. The Sandars Lectures were founded under the will and benefaction of the barrister Samuel Sandars in the late 19th century. He was, of course, of Trinity College, and he bequeathed £2,000 to endow this lecture series, widely regarded as one of the most prestigious of their kind. Between 1869 and his death, he also gave some 1,460 rare books and manuscripts to the University Library. So we remain really deeply grateful and indebted to Samuel Sandars for his benefaction and generous support, which have helped us to build one of the world's greatest library collections here in Cambridge, but of course also this incredible series of speakers. And with that, it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome this year's Sandars reader, Joan Winterkorn, and to welcome you, our audience here and online. And it's lovely to have such a great crowd in the room. Thank you so much for coming, everybody, for the first lecture. Now, many of you will know Joan by repute, but I want to say a few words of introduction. She is one of the world's most distinguished advisors on archives and manuscripts in private practice since about 2012, but of course her earlier career was at Bernard Quaritch. We shall hear more about that, I'm sure, and earlier still at Cornell University in her native United States. Joan has so many different hats that she's worn for us all over many, many years. She is a trustee of the Friends of the Nation's Libraries, who do so much to support the work of libraries like our own. She's also a former member of the Acceptance in Lieu Panel, a holder of the Royal Society of Literature's Benson Medal, an honorary MA of the University of Cambridge, and she was awarded an MBE in the New Year's Honours in 2023. That honour for services to heritage and to culture. And if Joan won't mind, I'll also add on a personal note, an absolute guiding star in terms of my own personal and professional practice as a librarian and working with archives, but to so many of us in the library and archive and the heritage profession more widely. She is a friend extraordinaire to our research and our national libraries, and we couldn't do it without her. Joan's lectures are entitled, What Will Survive of Us? Today's lecture is called Collecting and Preserving Contemporary and Historic Archives. And in this lecture, Joan will explore how cultural, institutional and policy considerations have shaped the collecting of archives, with Joan giving us a glimpse behind the scenes, some of the insights into the challenges and the triumphs of her distinguished career and the collection she has helped to build. For those who are here in person today, there is a reception and an opportunity to look at some of the manuscripts that Joan might have had a part in over the years at the University Library in the Milstein Centre. So please do, it's less than 5 minutes walk from here to the front of the UL. We'll be there to welcome you in. For those online, have a nice cup of tea afterwards and come back tomorrow. Tomorrow we're in the same time and the same place here at Robinson. We are sold out in person, but places are still available online. So sign up for the online if you haven't had the opportunity to get an in-person ticket for tonight. Tomorrow the lecture is entitled A Jigsaw with No Edge Pieces, and that will explore the archival coalface in more detail with different case studies. And then on Thursday, I'm really delighted with this too, as her final engagement as a Sandars reader, Joan will join us at the University Library of John Wells, the senior archivist at the University of Cambridge Library, for a day-long masterclass for about 20 early career archivists, librarians, booksellers and scholars, which I think is absolutely wonderful, exploring acquiring archives, insights in the trade and from the stacks. And I wouldn't do the job today if I hadn't had that kind of supervision, insights and coaching from people like Joan. So I'm really delighted that opportunity is there for those who are forming their career within our professions. Members of the university and our many distinguished guests, please join me in giving a traditional welcome to Joan Winterkorn as she comes to deliver her first Sandars lecture.
Thank you for that, Jessica, and thank you for coming out on a dark November night. Very nice to see so many people here and online. For the better part of a year, in 2003 to 4, I spent several days a week in an elegant drawing room in fashionable Mayfair. I was valuing the John Murray Publishing Archive. The desk where I worked was next to the fireplace where Byron's memoirs had been consigned to the flames. His lordship's portrait hung over the fireplace, seeming to watch down over my shoulder, and he still dominates the room. Those present in May 1824, a month after the poet's death, included his publisher John Murray II, his executor John Cam Hobhouse, Thomas Moore, the poet and friend to whom Byron had once given the memoir, and who had then passed it to Murray, and representatives of Lady Byron and of Byron's half-sister Augusta Lee. After days of arguments and disagreement, the 5 men made a decision, and page by page, they fed Byron's memoirs into the fire. Well, 2 years earlier, I had been at the Bryn Mawr Jones Library at the University of Hull, a long way, you might think, from Mayfair. After major renovations in 1969, an architectural critic described the library as a stubby, crinkle-cut, brutalist tower. Most enduring confidant, mistress and muse, Monica Jones, had died. And Bernard Quaritch, the London booksellers for whom I was working at the time, had been asked to prepare a probate valuation of papers found in her house. This was the home she shared with Larkin from 1983 until his death in 1985, and where she remained for the next 16 years. For 30 years, Larkin had been the librarian at Hull, and the papers were moved there for inspection. There was no grand fireplace in the room where I was to work, and no trace of the industrial shredder, which Larkin's close friend and library colleague, Betty McCarrath, had used to shred his diaries, some 30 volumes of them, which he had then incinerated for good measure. In his final hours, Larkin had begged Monica to destroy his diaries. She didn't have the physical strength to do it herself, but Betty honored his request, a page at a time. Waiting for me at Hull were large boxes stuffed with great bundles of unsorted letters and postcards, many with amusing illustrations, Valentines, Christmas cards, and Easter cards, telegrams, photographs, and ephemera. There were, I finally determined, more than 2,000 letters and cards, together about 7,500 pages, dating from December 1946 to April 1984, all from Larkin to Monica Jones. His diaries might have been destroyed, but here was an almost daily, intimate chronicle of every aspect of Larkin's life, for better and for worse, over almost 4 decades. If he posted a letter to her once a week, Larkin would have added something to the letter each day. And while addressing Monica, he often seemed to be talking to himself. I love the sense that sometimes he's, late at night, he's writing and you feel him trying to decide whether he's going to allow himself to go into Eeyore mode or not. How self-pitying is he going to be? I mean, he is just in those letters. When the editor, Anthony Thwaite, preparing Larkin's selected letters, Monica had shown him about 20 letters, most of which he included in his volume. The biographer, Andrew Motion, had seen others. He's written about his madcap adventure, taking Monica back to the house in Hayden Bridge, which she had locked up and left when she moved to Hull, and where she thought there might be some further papers. Motion describes there were letters stored and scattered and hidden everywhere in the old house. And together they found about 200, which he drew upon for his biography. But neither editor nor biographer was prepared for this vast new discovery. And it was fascinating to observe them both in my office at Quaritch when they first saw what Monica Jones had kept hidden for so long, all 7,500 pages of letters. There's often a single letter or a group of letters that stands out in my memory long after an archive has found a permanent home. Here there were several. On the 4th of April, 1948, Larkin writes that his father had died on Good Friday, and he and his mother had been hopelessly looking at the stock in the house. He gives precise details of the 100 pounds of jam and the 25 Kilner jars of bottled fruit, the 17 dozen boxes of matches, and the shoebox of chocolate he had shifted that morning, all from one small cupboard, adding that, "I don't know what will happen to it all." Whatever Larkin did with those jams and fruit, that sad task is forever captured in the poem he was writing that day. An April Sunday brings the snow. The poem was still unpublished at his death. One further story from that memorable Larkin hoard. In January 1956, Larkin told Monica that he was trying to write a poem about something we saw in Chichester. They had visited together in late December. He subsequently complained of his slow progress. By February, as a sort of Valentine, while complaining that he was sick of his tomb poem, he sent it to her unfinished, to give you something special from me for that day. It's complete except for the last verse, which I can't seem to finish. Do let me know what you think of it. What he sent, of course, was the working draft of an Arundel tomb, still struggling with the final lines. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come, or should it be, has grown, to be their final blazon and to prove our almost instinct, almost true, that what, or perhaps all that, survives of us is love. But if Larkin the poet here sees survival memorialized in stone, Larkin the librarian and man of letters had another vision of what should survive of us. We will return to him a little later. In 1962, the preeminent Cambridge librarian and bibliographer A.N.L. Munby published The Cult of the Autograph Letter in England. He explored the habits and some of the insatiable autograph collectors of the 19th century, including William Upcott, Dawson Turner, and Sir Thomas Phillips. And he described how, from the Romantic period on, the fashion for collecting autographs, by which he meant both clipped signatures and complete autograph letters, became a cult of staggering dimensions. It appealed to women as well as to men, an indoor pastime, and one that had a potential competitive element. The ladies could compare their collections, often mounted and bound in fine volumes, or they could show off the verses written specially by a favorite poet. This tremendous appetite led to auctioneers and booksellers offering autographs for sale, and also inspired several men with hands-on skills like Antique Smith and Major Byron to make their own additions to the available stock. In May 1819, Sotheby's held its first sale devoted entirely to autograph letters. The William Upcott sale of 1846 included an extraordinary range of British historical letters and manuscripts, many of them acquired in rather dubious circumstances from John Evelyn's descendants. Sir Frederick Madden was able to secure some of the more important Upcott volumes for the British Museum Library, while the Evelyn family paid considerable sums to reclaim their heritage. By the 1860s, Sotheby's was holding about 5 annual sales of royal, historical, and literary letters and manuscripts. Through the first decades of the 20th century, London dealers like Maggs Brothers and others were producing hefty catalogs of tempting autographs. Chief among the customers for these auction and dealer offerings were private collectors, whether bidding for themselves or through agents. Sir Thomas Phillips was notable, and later Alfred Morrison, but also such distinguished American collectors as Pierpont Morgan and Henry Huntington. In 1930, a more modest but enthusiastic collector, Dorothea Charnwood, Lady Charnwood, published an engaging memoir, An Autograph Collection and the Making of It. She detailed her impulse to collect, what qualities she most valued in the letters she acquired, how and from whom she purchased them, and offered advice to other would-be collectors. She also noted with regret, this will be a theme that returns, that without doubt, of late, the best letters and other manuscripts of our authors have gone to Americans. English buyers cannot stand against those in the United States, and I fear that this state of things is bound to increase, just as it has done with British art. Her object, she said, was to show how much fun can be got out of an English collection whose value is counted in pounds, even though that of American collections is reckoned by hundreds. Well, I have a personal affection for the Charnwood collection, comprising several large bound volumes of individual letters. It had been deposited at the British Library by her descendants. The library was anxious to bring the Charnwood collection into public ownership, and fairly early on in my days at Quaritch, I was asked to provide a valuation. In the sort of test that might have been set by Peter Croft, Munby's successor as King's College librarian, I challenged myself to try to identify the writer of each letter from the handwriting or the content before looking at the signature. Occasionally, the content made me question, even when I could read a signature, question whether or not this was right. A man who seemed sadly distracted, having neither ate nor slept well this 12-month, nor have my former consistency of mind, wrote to a close friend saying, I must withdraw from your acquaintance and see neither you nor the rest of my friends any more, if I may but leave them quietly. The recipient of the letter was Samuel Pepys, and yes, the letter was from Isaac Newton. I hadn't been aware of the virtual breakdown he suffered in 1693, and shocking as I found this letter, I could only imagine Pepys's reaction when he had received it. Another Charnwood letter, sent to a physician about a century and a half later, requests the doctor's opinion and advice about a woman in her 29th year, saying, a peculiar reserve of character renders it difficult to draw from her all the symptoms of her malady, the writer reports, but she notes that she had grown rapidly emaciated, mentions her pulse, the only time she allowed it to be felt, her shortness of breath and paroxysms of coughing. The patient's resolution to contend against illness being very fixed, she has never consented to lie in bed for a single day, sitting up from 7 in the morning till 10 at night, rejecting all medical aid and insisting that nature shall be left to take her own course. Several days later, in a further letter, this time to a friend, the writer says that the physician sent medicine which the patient would not take. Finally, the patient relented. If you will send for a doctor, she said, I will see him now. But it was far too late, and she died several hours later. What survives are these unbearably moving letters by Charlotte Bronte, one to Dr. Epps and the other to Elizabeth Gaskell, written from her sister Emily's deathbed. Well, however profound, moving, revealing, or humorous, light, and trivial individual letters might be, they are documents out of context. What comes before? What happens next? Who else was present? Is there further evidence? What I love and what I always want is the fullest possible picture. The evidence that can be found in an extensive archive and which may be supported, enhanced, or completely contradicted by the papers in other archives. I'm happiest with tin trunks, boxes, carrier bags, entire rooms full of letters, manuscripts, journals, and diaries, commonplace books, maps, drawings, bills, and accounts, and the bits and pieces that record the lives of our predecessors and of our contemporaries, and reveal everything from their greatest triumphs and achievements to the smallest domestic details of how they spent their days. To untie bundles of correspondence in someone's attic and read letters tied up by the recipient a century or two ago, or just a few decades ago with contemporary archives, is to release those voices and allow them to speak again. While high-spot autographs were being sold and traded and a market for them established, significant historical archives were being carefully preserved in the muniment rooms of stately homes or deposited in county record offices, larger municipal libraries, and university libraries. The great family and estate archives, as well as papers of politicians and diplomats, were recorded and often cataloged in comprehensive detail by the Historical Manuscripts Commission and the National Records Association. Their focus was historical rather than contemporary, and separate literary, theatrical, scientific, and artist archives were not generally part of their remit. It would be hard to suggest a date when interest began to develop in purchasing and preserving not just choice autographs and individual manuscripts, but complete archives. But we might look across the Atlantic to see early stirrings. In the first quarter of the 20th century, some of the great American industrialists, Pierpont Morgan, Henry Huntington, Henry Folger, Henry Frick, all the Henrys, and others, purchased British and continental books, manuscripts, art, and antiques with vigorous enthusiasm and very deep pockets. They were shipped west by the boatload. Some, like Henry Huntington, also acquired complete archives, most notably the vast collection of Stowe papers, covering 1,000 years of British history, the Battle Abbey papers, which Thomas Phillips had previously owned, the Ellesmere and the Hastings papers, all now at the Huntington in San Marino. The University of Michigan was the beneficiary of the 18th century archives and collections purchased by William Clements, documenting Britain's conduct of the American War of Independence. This began to develop further after the Second World War, when American universities and university libraries grew at an unprecedented rate, due in part to the 1944 Servicemen's Readjustment Act, generally known in America as the GI Bill. There was a new focus on attracting and retaining the brightest faculty and students. In Texas, Harry Hunt Ransom, an academic who had arrived in Austin in 1935 as a part-time English instructor, had climbed the academic ladder. By the early 1960s, he was in a position of influence. He considered how the University of Texas might be put on the map and urged the university to collect more British and American literature, particularly the period since 1870. He saw that manuscripts and archives could be the key to creating special research collections. Archives would attract scholars, researchers, and writers, whose work would in turn attract students. They could create opportunities for conferences and exhibitions, spark international interest, and perhaps the support of donors and benefactors. Ransom, for whom the library at Texas is now named, was able to convince the university trustees to back his instincts and provide a generous budget. Ably assisted by such dealers as Lou David Feldman of the House of LDF and the American Jacob Schwartz, who established the Ulysses bookshop in London, Ransom went on a buying spree. Other American universities and libraries began to follow suit with active acquisition programs. Some collected with care and discrimination. Others appear to have adopted a wholesale approach and swept up every last scrap, hoping that at least some of the papers they took in would prove to be of lasting importance. American authors, and I should add American politicians, could at that time receive tax credits for donating their own papers, and many were happy to clear their shelves while reducing the annual tax bill. It was, I think I'm right in saying, the papers of Richard Nixon that finally brought that system to an end, with great court cases over the sums of money that were being told he could take off his taxes. But my former Quaritch colleague, Arthur Freeman, a poet as well as an outstanding bookseller, considered this in The Gift Outright. The taxes that I did not pay this year by giving 80 pages of rough drafts of poems less than 80 people cared to read completed to a library, tax-free, could salary a modest staff of readers to read no one else but me for a whole day, as if I could or would. And yet, of course, he did. Approaches were made to British writers, and many were flattered to receive warm letters from American librarians offering a home for their manuscripts and correspondence. In April 1960, Philip Larkin wrote to the Royal Society of Literature, alerting them to this new aspect of the situation, the practice of direct solicitation by American libraries, principally university libraries, of living British authors for the gift of manuscripts or what he called worksheets. Many individual manuscripts, small files of juvenilia, and larger collections of correspondence and papers were indeed donated by British authors, until gossip in the literary world made it clear that money was changing hands at some libraries, and the generous donations were not their only option. The trade in literary archives was healthy and growing. Now, in 1975, after working as a manuscript librarian in Albany, New York, and an archivist in London, I returned to Cornell University, my alma mater, where I became the assistant and then the acting rare book librarian for the next 4 years. Cornell is now below the radar when complaints are made about archives being exported. Texas, Emory, the Beinecke Library at Yale, Harvard, the Bird Collection at New York Public, Indiana's Lilly Library, and the Lockwood Library at the University of Buffalo, where they had been collecting poetry manuscripts since the 1930s, are seen as greater threats. But in the 1950s and 1960s, Cornell was actively building British literary collections. Their Wordsworth holdings were second only to those at Dove Cottage, and when I arrived, they had an outstanding collection of Bernard Shaw manuscripts, correspondence, and printed material, the archives of Ford Madox Ford and Wyndham Lewis, the James Joyce collection that had once belonged to his brother Stanislaus, complete with manuscripts for sections of Ulysses, and much, much more. In those years at Cornell, I assisted numerous scholars and readers who came to use our collections. It was the joy of working for a very small department, that there wasn't anything that you didn't get to do, from sitting at the desk to reshelving the books to dealing with everyone who walked through the door. And working with these scholars, I learned about their research interests, and what other archives they were consulting or visiting. I became well acquainted with colleagues at other North American libraries, learned about their libraries' collecting interests, and the strength and extent of this one-way transatlantic trade in British archives. And I got to know the dealers in New York, California, and London, who made frequent and tempting offers, even making it as far as Ithaca, New York upon occasion. One of the visiting readers in the autumn of 1976 was Michael Holroyd, distinguished biographer of Lytton Strachey and Augustus John. Michael was in the early stages of research for what became his monumental 4-volume authorized biography of Bernard Shaw, a project so vast that it would be a dozen years before the first volume was published. When visitors made the long journey to upstate New York and were staying in Ithaca for more than a few days, I tended to offer hospitality at lunch or dinner, or introduce them to the bars of College Town. During Michael's stay, we had a number of conversations where he shared stories about his earlier biographies, his difficulties with the editor of Shaw's letters, who was outraged by Michael's appointment as the official biographer, and about libraries, archives, and manuscripts. He and Paul Levy, author of the standard work on the philosopher G.E. Moore and the Cambridge Apostles, were co-founders and trustees of the Strachey Trust, a charity established in 1972 by Alex Strachey, widow of Lytton's brother James, who had been the translator of Freud. The aim of the Strachey Trust was to make literary papers more readily accessible to scholars. There were several strands to their work. They wished to slow the tide of papers going abroad and find ways to encourage and enable British institutions to retain them at home. Another key ambition was to trace where manuscripts available to the public were to be found. Using royalties from Lytton Strachey's estate, they funded a pilot project at the University of Reading, headed by David Sutton, to survey the holdings of about 500 large and small British and Irish repositories. The result was the Location Register of 20th Century Literary Manuscripts and Letters, which was eventually published by the British Library in 2 volumes in 1988, before becoming an online union catalogue, still being enlarged. The Location Register was later expanded to cover literary manuscripts from the 18th and 19th centuries. Well, over the next few years, Michael and I kept in touch about Shavian matters and Strachey Trust developments. I loved my years at Cornell, but I began to be restless. In 1978, the rare book librarian, Don Eddy, my boss, became the second Munby Fellow at Cambridge, and I was made acting rare book librarian. Don was an outstanding bibliographer and scholar, and a wildly enthusiastic collector who could deplete our annual acquisition budget in record time. It was usually spent the day before the new budget year began. So and I believe he also did his best in his year as Munby Fellow to assist the rare book librarians here in spending their budgets. Don introduced me to his favorite booksellers, took me to auctions in New York and to the Grolier Club, and it was a great pleasure to work with him. But we had very different views about making readers welcome or encouraging people to actually use our collections. The librarian's office, there was a huge window that looked out over the reading room, and Don's security system was that he would stand with his hands pressed against this window and his nose was pressed against it, glaring at anyone who was daring to use anything in our reading room until they would usually just give up and go. A very useful security system, but not particularly useful if you actually like readers. And in Don's absence, I had opened up the department and wasn't sure this approach could be sustained when he returned. We had the Audubon double elephant folios, and there's a wonderful ornithology school at Cornell. No one had ever been allowed to come in and see them. So I started doing, it was once a month, the Friday lunchtime show and tell. We're getting 2 large ornithologists to help hold up the volumes. And people finally had to book places to come and see them. And I had so much fun that year, but I couldn't bear the thought of what would happen if I stayed and watched it all shutting down. Then unexpectedly and quite by chance, I happened to go to an antiquarian book fair in Boston in November of '78, where I was offered a job in the English department at Bernard Quaritch Antiquarian Booksellers in London. I was flown over to be interviewed by the owner, accepted the job, and by the time Don was returning from Cambridge, I was headed to London. It's one thing to kind of cross the Atlantic again. It's another thing to go from the library world into the trade. And those first days at Quaritch were a baptism by fire. The auction season was in full flow, and there were daily trips to Christie's, where Arthur Houghton's books and manuscripts were being sold, viewings and sales at Sotheby's Bond Street, at Chancery Lane, Christie's, South Kensington, and Phillips. Quaritch in those days, and I think still true, represented the majority of the national and university libraries, as well as many American libraries and private collectors. I had to view and assess the numerous lots in which clients were interested, then advise them about condition, estimates, and bidding strategies. When I was sent off at the last minute to bid at my first sale, the managing director remembered to quickly show me the Quaritch code as I grabbed my A to Z and tried to figure out what I was doing. There were several advantages to all this in-person auction viewing. I had to inspect a wide range of material to see how the auction house chose to catalog it, sometimes note things they had ignored but I thought were interesting, observe who else was viewing the lots and might also be bidding at the sale. There was a wonderful Scottish porter at Sotheby's who was very fond of Jean Archibald, who was the librarian at the British Library at that time, for whom we would always be bidding. And if Jock had noticed someone he didn't think should get the book, that Jean might want, bidding against it, he did have a way of kind of just nudging me to observe who else was looking at this and might be competition in the sale room. As these were pre-fax and long pre-email days, advising clients usually necessitated telephone conversations. My senior colleagues dealt with the important private collectors, but they were happy for me to speak with most of the libraries. And it proved an ideal way to get to know librarians, many of whom became very good friends, and to learn from them about their collections, their own enthusiasms, and areas for which they happen to have special funds available, not generally known in the outside world. When not dealing with auctions, I cataloged and sold books and the odd manuscript, autograph, or small group of letters. Occasionally, Quaritch would be asked to value or advise on an archive. The reluctance of my colleagues to take on this sort of work meant it usually fell to me. One of my first undertakings was at a record office in Sussex. I worked my way through a large tin trunk of deeds and documents, carefully noting, listing, putting a price against each item. Adding up the figures at the end of the day, I discovered the total was almost as much as the great Warwick Castle muniments had just sold for, and realized this might not be the best approach. About this point, archives and valuations began to play a more significant role in my Quaritch life. I was contacted by private owners, including Sir Simon Codrington, 3rd Baronet of Doddington Park in Gloucestershire. The obituary of Sir Simon in the Peerage News in 2005 notes that he had a colorful marital career, much discussed in the tabloid press in the 1970s and 80s. And he was, in fact, in the middle of one of his divorces when he contacted me, as he had to account for the value of his family papers, which were on deposit at the Gloucester Record Office. The figure I suggested after studying the catalog might have pleased an owner needing to repair the roof, but not someone negotiating alimony payments. Sir Simon decided he would sell the archive. The record office was absolutely incensed, well, the archivist was absolutely incensed, and would not even consider a private treaty sale, though I suggested that the papers might be broken into 3 sections so they could at least purchase the English estate papers and the Wyatt drawings for Doddington, not having it. For the most significant portion of the archive, the extensive papers relating to the Codrington estates and slaveholdings in the West Indies, particularly Antigua and Barbuda, I spoke with several libraries in Britain and then in America. No one was interested. Eventually, Sir Simon consigned the West Indian papers to Sotheby's, where they were offered for sale in December 1980. Well, it was a sale that attracted considerable publicity and inflammatory statements, with letters, editorials, articles, even comments in Parliament about owners, foreign buyers, and access. As a result of my work on the Codrington papers, I started looking more closely at archival ownership. I wondered if it was common for such significant archives to be held on deposit, and if there were restrictions or policies governing withdrawals. Philip Gaskell, then librarian of Trinity College, was planning a letter to the Times and contacted me. I wrote to him reporting on the surprisingly large number of archives and collections at risk in county and local record offices. Some county archivists telling me that 95 to 98% of their major holdings were held on deposit. Mounting my high horse, as I was something I often did, I added that if archivists regret and resent having their collections collections in their custody withdrawn, why are they so reluctant to establish conditions of deposit? It's a question I continued to ask for many years. I looked at developments and changes in the rapidly expanding auction market and listed archives offered and sold as single lots, and those that had been broken into separate lots and dispersed, which is my idea of, when they talk about a lost archive, it isn't one that goes to America, it is one that has been dispersed. I noted that in 1974 to 75, the Sotheby's manuscript department had a staff of 2, while 5 years later, they had a full-time staff of 8. A single sale in December of 1979 had included the archive of G.E. Moore, the papers of Augustus John, large collections of the papers of Rupert Brooke and John Ruskin, and the second and final part of Lady Gregory's collection of Yeats. The Moore and John papers were sold en bloc, the others were scattered. These developments were increasingly apparent to those in the archive sector. The Royal Commission on Historical Manuscripts began holding seminars on their sale catalog monitoring scheme, regularly inviting me to address them on the dealer's role and perspective. In 1989, the Society of Archivists held a training day on archives at auction, focusing on the sale and purchase of manuscripts. 6 years later, the Society's annual conference again included a talk on the role of the trade. A highlight of the 1995 conference was the address given by the Shadow Secretary of State for the National Heritage, the Right Honorable Chris Smith, MP. Which brings us to the trade and modern literary archives, where there was significant activity in Britain and America, particularly in the 1980s and 90s. In 1979, Emory University received a gift of $105 million worth of Coca-Cola shares from Robert and George Woodruff. It was at the time the largest ever gift made to an American university. When Emory's librarian and head of special collections visited Quaritch, giving themselves with all this money an outing, we discovered that they held a sizable collection of 19th century three-decker novels, not necessarily in very good condition, and the papers of Joel Chandler Harris, creator of the Uncle Remus tales. Those were the highlights. But 2 professors in the English department at Emory, Richard Ellman, the biographer of Joyce and Yeats, and Ron Schuchart, also working on Joyce and Yeats, as well as Eliot Pound and modern British and Irish literature, saw the opportunities the Woodruff gift might offer. Ron Schuchart had done his graduate work at the University of Texas, so he may have been inspired by Harry Ransom. When, in July, and as mentioned above, December 1979, Sotheby's held 2 major sales of Yeats material from Lady Gregory's estate at Coole Park, it was clear there was a powerful new player in the literary archive market. Emory soon turned its attention to the papers of other Irish and British writers. Then in 1988, the Harry Ransom Center at Texas appointed a new director. Thomas Staley had been at the University of Tulsa, where, as a professor of English and then provost, he encouraged the university to acquire the papers of contemporary women writers, including Muriel Spark, Jean Rhys, and Stevie Smith, as well as novelists, V.S. Naipaul, Paul Scott, and others. Arriving in Texas, he turned his attention to British theater, a field he loved. He purchased the papers of Tom Stoppard, David Hare, John Osborne, Arnold Wesker, and many, many others, while also adding to and expanding the Ransom's other literary collections. He took great pleasure in organizing conferences, symposia, exhibitions, visiting fellowships, and travel grants, all of which raised the library's international profile, and held annual parties in London, which attracted further offers of archives from writers and from dealers. As the market across the Atlantic continued to expand, British libraries faced a dilemma. In 1979, Philip Larkin had addressed the manuscripts group of SCONAL, the Standing Conference of National and University Libraries. His talk, titled A Neglected Responsibility, Larkin spoke movingly of both the magical and the meaningful value of manuscripts. He also expressed his regret that there was no union catalog of literary manuscripts and no source of information about prices paid. He turned to what he called the modern literary manuscript situation, that for the last 40 or 50 years, and more particularly during the last 20 years, he said, the papers of the major British writers of this century have been intensively collected, not by the British, but by American libraries. A meeting of British national and university librarians to discuss modern literary manuscripts, he said, resembles an annual convention of stable door lockers. He spoke of the warnings he had raised in 1960 and his subsequent initiative, supported by the Arts Council and the Pilgrim Trust, to establish a national manuscript collection of contemporary poets. Through his scheme, Operation Manuscript, as he referred to it, individual manuscripts would be acquired, then sold to libraries at subsidized price, creating a distributed national poetry collection. But interest had been limited, supportive grants were reduced as a result, and ultimately the scheme ended. If half Sconnell's libraries had bought one manuscript a year, he scolded them, the scheme would have boomed. Larkin wasn't blaming the Americans for the state of affairs in 1979, concluding simply that we have not been beaten in a fair fight, we have not fought at all. By the 1990s, British librarians were increasingly turning their attention to 20th century archives. Some, like Christopher Shepherd of the Brotherton Collection at Leeds, had since the early 1980s been acquiring the papers of Leeds poets and writers, of publishers and small presses. Through the booksellers Colgan Duvall and Colin Hamilton, the National Library of Scotland and Edinburgh University Library were building collections of Hugh MacDermott, George Mackay Brown, and other contemporary Scottish writers. In 1994, Michael Holroyd put Kathleen Tynan, widow of the great theatre critic Ken Tynan, in touch with me. Texas had expressed interest in her husband's papers, but she was anxious to conclude a sale that would not involve staged payments over 3 years. Could I help? I met with Michael Borey, keeper of manuscripts at the British Library, who certainly seemed interested. He and the modern literary curator were all too well aware of the major theatre archives going abroad. After taking Michael Borey to lunch with the charming Kathleen, he was convinced, if the money could be found. Fortunately for Michael and for Kathleen, the library had just received its annual VAT rebate, and the purchase was concluded in record time. It was the easiest sale I have ever made. This seemed to whet the British Library's appetite, and over the next decade or so, I was able to offer and sell them the archives of playwrights, actors, and directors, including Laurence Olivier, Peter Nichols, Rafe Richardson, Ronald Harwood, Max Stafford Clark, Timberlake Wharton Baker, and others, and to arrange for the papers of the playwright Peter Barnes to be donated through the British Library's American Friends. Even with this fresh activity, British librarians faced significant challenges. It was once again, through Michael Holroyd, an inveterate campaigner on behalf of authors, libraries, and literature, that I became more deeply involved. Michael was then president of the Royal Society of Literature. Isabel Quigley was writing a history of the society, which had been founded in 1820, before they had to move from their spacious rooms at 1 Hyde Park Gardens. In the boxes of early papers, she had come across letters from Samuel Taylor Coleridge and others. Perhaps they should be sold to raise necessary funds? I was invited to advise the Royal Society of Literature. After an initial inspection, I concluded it was indeed an archive of outstanding research potential, and it was largely unstudied. It should not, I said, be broken up or its highlights extracted. My fuller survey over a very happy summer in those gracious rooms confirmed its importance, documenting a singular institution of British intellectual life when literature encompassed antiquarian, historical, philosophical, and philological interests. I then had to consider what institution might provide the best home if the archive was to be offered for sale. The RSL Council agreed with my proposal. Curator John Wells came to see the archive and must have shared my enthusiasm. Funds for acquisition were offered by the V&A, the Friends of the National Libraries, and the University Library's own friends, and the archive found its new home in Cambridge University Library more than 25 years ago. When not working on their archive, I was drawn into other discussions with the Council of the Royal Society of Literature. They were carrying out a review of their own work and objectives, considering how best to continue to support writers and literature. A subject that came up regularly was the export of contemporary archives, what assistance might be given to keep them in Britain, and the restrictive guidelines of the National Heritage Memorial Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund. Two recent sales had focused attention on these guidelines. The first was the archive of Alan Sillitoe, born and raised in Nottingham, author of Saturday Night and Sunday Morning and The Loneliness of the Long-Distance Runner. Sillitoe had asked Roy Davids, formerly of Sotheby's, but by then an independent dealer, to sell his papers. Roy sensibly offered them to the University of Nottingham, who were excited at the prospect of an acquisition. They applied to the newly established Heritage Lottery Fund for a grant. But the Lottery Fund trustees decided they would follow the Memorial Fund's policy that it excluded living writers from consideration and declined to help. As a result, Roy sold Alan Sillitoe's papers to the Lilly Library in Indiana. Not long afterwards, Roy was asked to sell the archive of another living writer. Knowing that no financial assistance would be available here, he went straight to Emory University with the papers of the nation's poet laureate, Ted Hughes. At the request of the Royal Society of Literature, I prepared a paper on modern archives and British collecting policies, which I presented to the Council in August of 1998. The paper concluded with my view that it was essential that the trustees of the National Heritage Memorial Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund revise their policy and agree to support appropriate applications for the archives of living writers. I added in a private note to Council that I thought it was important to stress that in lobbying for funds to assist British libraries and writers, the Royal Society of Literature was not campaigning against or denigrating American libraries or flinging a gauntlet at Tom Staley's feet. That didn't always come through. After discussions with the Royal Society and the Society of Authors, the next step required direct contact with Stephen Green, a policy officer at the Heritage Lottery Fund. Various meetings were arranged, and Green sent drafts of consultation papers on the Lottery's fund evolving policies on archives. He solicited our views, probably not anticipating the lengthy letters of advice and instruction I would feel compelled to send. After setting out for him why I didn't think Heritage Lottery Fund intervention would inflate prices, I explained the tax disadvantages that most authors faced if selling to a British institution, a more significant disincentive than any slight price differential, and I made various recommendations. I ended by adding that while our meetings and exchanges had concentrated on modern literary archives, we should not restrict ourselves to writers. I was always already including myself in their thinking. There are political, medical, and scientific archives presently for sale, which would all be worth acquiring. Would we turn away the Crick and Watson archive because they are both still living? I wrote that in July 2000, and it was deeply satisfying when in the autumn of 2001, the first grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund for the archive of a living figure enabled the Wellcome Trust to purchase the papers of Francis Crick. Their policy had been changed and a precedent was established. Well, after the years of dedicated advocacy and campaigning by largely independent individuals and societies, the time had come for a more official approach. This was not just in archives, but across the museum sector. On behalf of the Treasury, Sir Nicholas Goodison undertook a review on securing the best for our museums, private giving, and government support. Published in January 2004, Though he did not specifically discuss archives in his report, he made clear when we met that he was sympathetic to our objectives. Goodison's recommendations about acceptance in lieu, private treaty sales, and various tax measures were all relevant. In response to the Goodison review, the British Library held a private dinner and discussion that September to consider modern literary and related archives securing the national collection. The letter of invitation explained that among those at the dinner would be authors, academics, political stakeholders, representatives from the main funding bodies, and key British Library staff. There was, I noted, no mention of the book trade. Following the discussion dinner, a paper was drawn up recommending a new UK-wide alliance to take forward a strategy and implement a program of actions. I have to quote that because it doesn't come out easily. Take forward a strategy and implement a program of actions. It would be convened by the British Library, chaired by an appropriate independent advocate, and with a small representative working group of no more than 12 members to develop and implement an action plan. For that appropriate advocate, the British Library turned to a former culture secretary, the man who had shared the platform with Her Majesty the Queen when she officially opened the new British Library in 1998. Fortunately, Chris Smith, soon to be elevated to Baron Smith Finsbury, accepted the role. And despite being in the book trade, I was invited to be a member of what became the UK Working Group on the Literary Heritage. Various interests were represented, as members included the Poet Laureate, people from the Friends of the National Libraries, the Royal Literary Fund, the Society of Authors, and from publishers, together with representatives from national and university libraries and the National Archives. What wasn't established or immediately apparent was what our action plan should be. Reverting to my earlier interest in the role of tax and VAT in the sale of contemporary archives, and following on from Sir Nicholas Goodison's recommendation, a few of us put together proposals. We hoped there could be income tax relief for living authors selling their papers by private treaty. We proposed an extension of the acceptance in lieu scheme to enable writers to make offers and agreements in their lifetime, even if the benefit remained one that would be claimed by their estate. Not a man to hang about, Lord Smith arranged a meeting with the Treasury, and 4 of us accompanied him there. I wrote to Michael Holroyd the following day, reporting that the men at the Treasury seemed to listen with some interest, asked a lot of questions, and suggested we come back with further information. And that Chris Smith said he thought it was an exceedingly positive meeting, given the usual reaction of the Treasury. Under Lord Smith and Lord Howarth, his successor as chairman, there were further meetings with the Treasury and the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I have especially fond memories of one meeting with Andy Burnham, then Secretary of State at Department of Culture, Media and Sport. Asked about his time at Cambridge, where he read English literature, he said it was contemporary poetry that gave him the greatest pleasure. And who, Lord Howarth inquired, is your favorite poet? Without hesitation, he replied, Tony Harrison, and I was given a brief few minutes to tell him about Tony's fascinating notebooks. I will tell you something about them myself tomorrow. While our specific proposals were never adopted by the Treasury, they helped to shape what became the Cultural Gift Scheme, launched in March of 2013, providing tax relief for donors of cultural property to the nation. And one of the greatest successes of the Cultural Gift Scheme was the acceptance of the Spitting Image Archive allocated to Cambridge. While the UK Working Group was looking at policies and big pictures, University Special Collection librarians were concurrently developing their own modest proposal to establish a literary manuscripts and archives group. It was to support those working in the field, sharing information and practical advice, offering workshops, seminars, lectures, and training events, and encouraging access to and research on their collection. It would be open not just to curators, librarians, and archivists, but writers, researchers, and anyone who cared about collecting, preserving, and promoting literary manuscripts and archives. 20 years on, the important work of this group, GLAM, continues. Well, virtually all the players in this now expanding story were present at the British Library in October 2006 for Manuscripts Matter, a conference on collecting modern literary archives. It was a celebration as well as a forum for discussion, and like the dinner 2 years earlier, a lively event. There were panels of librarians from national, university, and regional libraries, authors, scholars, and even the trade. It was, I thought, appropriate and important that Tom Staley from Texas and Steve Ennis from Emory were there as speakers. I was sitting with Tom Staley during the national and regional panel. After listening to the impressive librarian from the University of Exeter, he said, "You should keep an eye on her, Joan. She's going to go places." And I'm pleased to say she has. 6 years later, the UK Literary Heritage Working Group reminded us that, yes, manuscripts still matter. A conference which gave us a chance to hear from librarians collecting, cataloging, and curating a fascinating range of archives, many unusual and attracting entirely new groups of researchers. From living writers whose papers were now in the vaults of many libraries, thanks to our campaigning work, and from some of the funders actively helping to save archives for the nation. I think Philip Larkin would have been gratified to see how much had changed. I don't remember the UK working group being formally wound up, but after the second conference, attendance at our meetings gradually tailed off. I think we felt we had done what we set out to do and simply stopped gathering. Tomorrow, I will leave behind the policies and politics and share with you thoughts on some of the archives I've had the pleasure and the privilege to study, handle, value, and sell. Thank you.